Okay, good evening and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library's series of Zoom conversations about the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Krenz from the Bentley Historical Library. Thanks for joining us. I'm really pleased that we have with us tonight Juli Highfill to discuss anti-fascism at U of M, defending democracy during the Spanish Civil War, a discussion that in some respects might feel all too timely. Juli is professor of Spanish literature and culture in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at U of M. Her research focuses on the Spanish historic avant-garde, popular film in the 1920s and 30s, and cultural production during the Spanish Republic and the Spanish Civil War. She's the author of two books, Portraits of Excess, Reading Character in the Modern Spanish Novel, and Modernism and Its Merchandise, the Spanish Avant-Garde and Material Affect in Spanish Film, Material Culture, 1920 to 1930. Her current project is Images in Flight, Popular and Political Affect in Spanish Film, 1920 to 1940. Tonight's session is closely related to courses that Juli teaches on the Spanish Civil War and student activism, courses in which, in fact, the students often conduct research using the collections of the Bentley Library. She serves as an occasional faculty for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives, and we will certainly be hearing more about the Lincoln Brigade later. So welcome, Juli. Many of you know our format. First, Juli will make a brief presentation, then she and I will have some discussion. That will take a little more than half an hour or so. Then we'll open to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions. And please do try to make sure that it's the Q&A function and not the chat function. That way we'll be sure to see it. I want to thank Rob Havey, our webinar administrator, for his help tonight, and also Lara Zeeland, who, as usual, has done great work getting the webinar set up and the word out. So tonight we're going to be discussing U of M students and the Spanish Civil War, the war which ended in 1939, with Francisco Franco installed in a dictatorship that lasted nearly 4 decades. The 1930s was a decade of tremendous upheaval and political realignment. Most students arriving on campus early in the decade were probably not yet feeling the effects of the Great Depression. They were focused on professional and personal goals, motivated by college spirit, and perhaps even politically indifferent to some extent. But within a few years, the Michigan Daily was covering war, running images such as some of those which I hope you saw just a moment ago, and which you'll see in a minute, and fascism was on the rise throughout the world. So students' futures and their debates and discussions about those futures had become much different. So Juli, please help us understand what things were like for students and student anti-fascist activism at Michigan as this turbulent decade moved toward a climax.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you to everyone who's organized this series, everyone at the Bentley, where I've done a lot of this research, especially in the wonderful digital archive of the Michigan Daily, which is just a treasure trove. Let me share the screen. Let's see. So I've put together images mainly from the Michigan Daily. And I'll start with the coverage in the Daily after the outbreak of war, the first weeks and months after the military uprising, which began July 18th in 1936. So this was the first article appearing in the Daily on July 19th. And the first articles during the first week reflect a lot of confusion, a fog about what's going on in Spain, who are these two sides in conflict. It had begun as a coup, and the generals, among them Francisco Franco, who organized the coup, expected the Spanish Republican government to fall within a few days or within a week or two. But they had coordinated with Spanish Morocco, the colonial Spanish army, in a portion in the north of Morocco that was the Spanish protectorate. They had coordinated with forces there and all over Spain. But when the different military cartels rose up, half of them were able to take power and half of them were not. So the country was split between those that surrendered or were taken by force by the military rebels and those that remained loyal to the Republic. So it takes a while to figure out what's going on, who's winning. And the first articles make it appear that the military rebels have won. But by the end of the first week, it becomes evident that the Republican government is holding on to the half of the territories in Spain they still control. Those that they were able to save from the military uprising, it was mostly because the workers were able to seize arms, or the local governments were willing to give the workers arms. So all these militias spontaneously rose up under political parties or unions. Then it takes a few months for a new People's Army to reorganize and to figure out who remained loyal to the Republic and who had gone over to the rebels. It also was very confusing here in the US to determine the ideologies of the opposing sides. Who were these generals? Was it just a military uprising, or could they accurately be called fascists? And when only half of Spain has been taken by the rebels, they face the problem that over half their troops are still in Morocco. So they have to organize an airlift. They can't cross the Strait of Gibraltar because the Spanish Air Force has remained loyal to the Republic, and they're getting bombed, any boats that try to cross. So they call to Italy and Germany to provide planes, and Mussolini sends planes, Hitler sends planes, and over a 4-week period, they gradually airlift the entire Spanish Army of Africa. After that, it becomes clear that the military rebels are affiliated, aligned with the fascists. And from then on, it becomes an anti-fascist cause and really the first battleground of fascism versus democracy. There's constant coverage, just daily coverage in the Michigan Daily of the news from Spain, a number of radio transmitted photographs. The Spanish Civil War becomes this great cause worldwide against fascism. And it represents the first massive civilian bombing in history. And the newsreels before the movies of those years are showing these massive civilian bombings and deaths and casualties, and the world is horrified. So I'll show you a few of the photographs that appeared in the daily during those first months. On the op-ed pages, a lot of fascinating debates take place. A history professor, Arthur Ayton, had been doing research in Seville in Spain up until May, so a couple of months before the Civil War started. And he writes a number of articles that are published on the op-ed pages supporting the military rebels. And students and a few other professors take issue and they write responses. So all through the Spanish Civil War, you see these debates on the op-ed pages. So the mobilization on campus in support of the Loyalists, the Spanish Republic, it takes a few months before it really gets in gear, but students organize first a club, Friends of Spanish Democracy, which is linked with other similar clubs across the country. In the spring, the Progressive Club is organized, and it's the local chapter of the American Student Union, which has chapters in major universities all over the country. And the ASU for several years had been organizing peace strikes. The student movement, which gradually builds starting in the early 30s, had been a pacifist organization. They took their cues from the British pacifist student organizations that emerged after World War I. Once the Spanish Civil War starts and it becomes this great anti-fascist cause, and one of the slogans is "Make Spain the tomb of fascism." Let's stop fascism in Spain and forestall a Second World War. Then the pacifist stance starts to fade. And there's a lot of dissension within the American Student Union, but they gradually move towards willingness to take arms against fascism. And another key organization that forms, that's both faculty and students participating, is the Committee for Medical Aid to Spain. And these organizations work a great deal in concert over the next 2 or 3 years. So the students organized a lot of events, rallies, they did fundraising, and one of the goals for student activists all across the country was to raise funds to purchase medical supplies and ambulances. And in the Big Ten, the universities competed, which university could raise the most funds for an ambulance. And some progressive Hollywood actors sent an ambulance across the country visiting different universities and delivering films that they showed on the campuses. Heart of Spain was one of the films. It was about the new techniques of blood transfusion that Dr. Norman Bethune, the Canadian physician, developed in Spain, and Spanish Earth, which was narrated by Ernest Hemingway, with the narration co-written by Hemingway and John Dos Passos. So they managed to raise large amounts of money for that period, a few hundred here and there, which was a lot of money at that time. This is a photograph of one of the ambulances that visited universities all over the country. And other activities they had to raise funds and build support for Spain. Halloween party with a poetry recital, film viewing. They would have a fast supper, meaning that they didn't really eat anything but soup and crackers. They were fasting and using their pocket money to donate to Spain. Spanish fiesta. They also had a Spanish week with an exhibit of Spanish posters and all sorts of coordinated activities to raise money. And every few weeks, it would seem, they would have visitors coming to Spain to lecture, delegates from the Spanish Republic, a couple of progressive priests. Father O'Flanagan was Irish. There was a progressive Spanish priest who came as well, whereas the Vatican at large, the Catholic Church at large, supported the military rebellion. Former volunteers who had fought in Spain came and spoke. A nurse, Leni Fuhr, who had served in Spain in the field hospitals. So looking at the daily in those years, it looks like it's just constant mobilization and activities in support of Spain. Now, there were 4 volunteers from U of M who went to Spain to either fight or drive ambulances. There were others who had graduated some years before, moved away, who also volunteered. These 4 volunteers were either currently students or had recently graduated or left. So Robert Cummins was the uncle of David Marinus, and some of you may have read Marinus's recent book, A Good American Family, which is about his parents who were also U of M students, activists during these same years, his uncle, and they all 3 went on to be members of the Communist Party and then suffered persecution during the McCarthy era. Another volunteer, Elman Service from Tecumseh. He became a prominent anthropologist later. He served in Spain. Harlan Call had dropped out the year before, but he was killed in Spain, and William Carney, the embedded journalist for the New York Times on Franco's side, was with troops who found his body and found a letter in his pocket, and they were able to identify him that way. And Ralph Neafus, who was a forestry student from New Mexico, recently graduated. And he was captured and presumed executed in Spain. But this becomes, once news breaks that he'd been captured with his fate still unknown, this becomes a huge cause and controversy on campus. So Neafus had been a forestry student, as I said, and this is a picture of him on the far right at the U of M biological station. He'd also been a member of the wrestling team, and he had been an activist for several years. He was one of the organizers of the first student workers union in the country, the Student Workers Federation, and one of their first actions was to organize a pinboy strike at the bowling alley, which was at the location of the Graduate Inn Hotel on Huron. And Neafus, along with 4 other students, were arrested for loitering. They were picketing. Then the trial is held, and the students are accused of tying up traffic. Neafus was found guilty, had planned to appeal in that middle article there on April 30th, 1937. Then on June 2nd, he suddenly cancels his appeal and pays the fine. And according to the records of the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, he set sail for Spain about 2 weeks later on June 16th. And Arthur Miller, in his memoir, Time Bends, describes driving Neafus to New York and seeing him off to Spain. It's a really fascinating little chapter. Then in March 38, word comes that Neafus had been captured. Students had sent a box of chocolates and cigarettes to the headquarters for the Lincoln Brigade in New York to send on to Neafus. And they sent back a little article, a blurb really, in the New York Times that this reporter, Carney, had interviewed Neafus among a group of prisoners. So a lot of mobilization immediately takes place. The Progressive Club has rallies, meetings. They press the university to, in turn, press the State Department to inquire into Neafus's fate. The Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, refuses to interfere. The Student Senate, by a single vote, rejected sending a resolution to Secretary Hull. About a month later, the reporter, William Carney, returned to that area where Neafus had been captured, and he asked some of the troops there what had happened to those prisoners, and they said they'd all been shot. But other than that, there was never any proof of what had happened. Another student, originally from Michigan, but had graduated some years before, believed that he had been executed. So gradually, the family and his friends, the students at U of M, accept that that must have been his fate. there's a binder that was put together by a researcher, Thomas Beauvais, that is in the Bentley, and it has all of this information, clippings, and at the end, there's a series of letters that his mother and sister wrote to Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, inquiring into what had happened to Ralph and pleading that they interfere, that they make contact with Franco's headquarters. But the United States, like the European democracies, maintained neutrality and non-intervention, and refused to interfere. It was also illegal for Americans to leave and volunteer in Spain. So they would typically land in France and cross the Pyrenees on foot. So the Spanish Civil War ended officially on April 1st, 1939, marking the beginning of 35 years of the Franco dictatorship. The Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact was signed on August 23rd, 1939, which reversed the Comintern's anti-fascist Popular Front strategy. The students mobilized at U of M had been part of that Popular Front. It had been a broad coalition of students who identify as liberals, socialists, communists, all uniting to oppose fascism. As I'll mention in a minute, this non-aggression pact suddenly split that broad coalition. Then a week after the non-aggression pact, the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, marking the beginning of World War II. So Spain indeed had failed to become the tomb of fascism. And after the Nazi-Soviet pact, that broad anti-fascist student movement was decimated. The Young Communist League membership took an anti-war, anti-imperialist stance, arguing a kind of both-sidism. And indeed, the liberal democracies had refused to aid Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And socialist and liberal students left the American Student Union. At U of M, the Young Communist League remained as kind of a rump organization, and they would pass out anti-war leaflets after World War II had already begun, during the London Blitz, and sentiment was clearly growing in support of the Allies. And so the young communists who were opposing the war weren't very well received. Some of them were expelled. And I believe in another class that Gary, perhaps you're teaching, some of the students are researching the expulsions of students, both before this period I'm talking about and after in 1940 and 41. So for those who might want to read more about this history, When the Old Left Was Young describes this nationwide student movement from 1929 to 41 by Robert Cohen, and includes quite a few details about what was happening here at the University of Michigan. David Marinus's book, A Good American Family, which I already mentioned, it has several chapters about student activism and the involvement of his parents and uncle during the Spanish Civil War, and his uncle's experience in Spain. And I mentioned Arthur Miller's Time Bins, which has about 10 or 11 pages describing driving Ralph Neafus to New York, while Miller is wondering, oh, should he volunteer too? But in the end, he does not. So I'll be happy to take any questions. This is a very complicated history, which I've probably simplified. The ideological complexities are intense, the geopolitics as well. So I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. You know, I appreciate this this really compact overview with some real detailed insights, which I think is really good. You're right. I mean, I'm not, of course, an expert in this era of history, but from what I have been reading, it was indeed very complicated. I mean, a lot of complexities, a lot of politics, intra and interfactional, right? I wonder if we could start, though, going back just a little bit and to talk a little bit about this sort of general shift from pacifism toward more engagement. And, you know, thinking that, you know, again, the US as a whole is kind of in a very isolationist phase. This is just, you know, 10 to 15 years after the horrors of the First World War, which are fresh in a lot of people's minds. But also a lot of the progressive students, aside from sort of a general pacifist idealism, are concerned that maybe U.S. interventions could just be the expansion, sort of a capitalist imperialism. Could you talk about that, and where does that show up on U of M's campus, if you see that in any of the material?
Well, I can't say that I've seen those debates appear on the pages of the Daily. I'm sure they took place, though. It's just that the Daily didn't tend to report the internal discussions of the Progressive Club. But in that book, When the Old Left Was Young, Robert Cohen describes the yearly conventions of the American Student Union and just the bitter disputes and fights and elections between the more pacifist-oriented students and those who were embracing collective security, they called it. And then in David Marinus's book, he describes one of their last meetings, which his parents attended, and that's when the more moderate centrist leadership was voted out of office and the communists took complete control, and the American Student Union just shrunk drastically, probably by 90% immediately. So yes, as you said, after World War I, it was the carnage of World War I, and that trench warfare was so much in the minds of young people, and they did not want another world war. So the Oxford Pledge was a resolution passed by the Oxford Union Debating Society, and students all over the US and in other countries of the world, they took that pledge, and it went, "This house will in no circumstance fight for its king and country." And so it was adapted, and it became the motto of the US pacifist movement up until the Spanish Civil War. And then, even then, it takes about a year before the ASU makes a turn towards collective security, willingness to take arms and to support student volunteers who were going to Spain to take arms.
And so, and the ASU is it seems like kind of a remarkable achievement to bring together communists, socialists, and liberals, and really, I mean, really motivated by the concern about fascism. Is that a fair?
Yes, I think from reading Robert Cohen, who's also written about the student movement in the 60s, I think it was larger in numbers than the movement in the 60s, which we hear a lot more about. Mm-hmm. They had peace strikes every year starting around 1932-33, and some thousands of students across the country would take part in these peace strikes every spring. It was a one-day symbolic strike. Mm-hmm. So it was a very large movement that's been forgotten, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to agree with that. You know, I mean, this is the kind of thing that, again, I had vaguely in my mind. You know, some things about this era, but I've just been really impressed getting ready for this about the level of activity on the part of students across the country. I wonder, I mean, this was also, of course, a period when there was a not insignificant fascist movement in the U.S. as well, right? I mean, the rise of the American Nazi Party and marches down Madison, you know, in New York, and a huge rally in Madison Square Garden and so forth. Is there any evidence of organized fascism on the U of M campus? Or in the area, you know?
I haven't seen it on campus. If I'd had more time, I would have shown some snippets of the debates among the more conservative students who would write into the op-ed pages, and you know, some of them, after Ralph Neafus was captured, for example, mocked him for going, you know, mocked his radicalism, and you know, he knew what he was signing up for. But I haven't seen any sign of fascist groups. But the Michigan Daily is full of articles during this same period about Father Coughlin, mm-hmm. Right-wing radio priest, openly anti-Semitic, who was broadcasting from Royal Oak all across the country. Mm-hmm. Big following, naturally, in Michigan. And the Black Legion, which was a Michigan, Ohio version of the Ku Klux Klan, who wore kind of black pirate robes. There's articles about them. Some of their members committed a murder, really several murders, but were finally arrested and convicted for one murder in Detroit. So all of that is in the Michigan Daily as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You had mentioned you mentioned a few. I mean, you mentioned you know, so the newsreels, the coverage of the war, sort of this really extensive involvement of progressive artists, writers, and so forth. Of course, we think of Hemingway, right? But you know, George Orwell wrote a very influential essay. And in a way, there's this mark of what we would now call, right, the intellectual class on the way this all develops. And I'm wondering, you mentioned Professor Ayton, but were there particular faculty at U of M who were helping to shape thinking on this campus, or who were supportive of progressive student activism or anti-fascist activism?
Well, I see often articles in opposition to Ayton by professor of Spanish, Albaladejo, who wrote in support of the Republic. And then in some of those articles I showed in the slideshow, for example, the one uh, on the formation of the Medical Aid Committee. There's a list of, 14 faculty members from all different departments, not just the medical school. So, yeah, I think there were lots of faculty, not communist aligned, although there were, I think, 7 or 8 faculty members who voted communist in a university mock election, and the regents wanted to find out who they were. um, I see a lot of references in the daily to Professor Slauson, who was giving a lot of lectures about ideology, about what is fascism, what is liberalism, democracy, and capitalism. So I think there were a lot of professors involved.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about the Lincoln Battalion and the Lincoln Brigade and the U of M students' involvement in that. But first, so it's my understanding that this was a battalion that really saw pretty heavy action and suffered heavy casualties. I mean, this was not just work sort of behind the lines. This was really right up in front. Is that?
Yes. There were approximately 2,800 volunteers from the US to the international brigades. Worldwide, 35,000 from, I think, 52 or so countries all over the world. And yeah, they were put in the middle of the action a month after they arrived. They would arrive in the International Brigade headquarters in Albacete near Valencia, near the Mediterranean on the east, have a month of training, and they were often put on the front lines. And a third of them did not return. A third of them were killed in Spain. There were also about 100 medical personnel, a lot of women. And the Abraham Lincoln Brigade is really kind of a misnomer. It's an amalgamation. There was a Lincoln Battalion, a George Washington Battalion, but a lot of the Lincoln volunteers actually were with the Canadians, the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, but for shorthand, we call them the Lincoln Brigaders. They were very diverse. A third of them were Jewish. The majority were workers, but there was a large minority of college students. They weren't all real young. They ranged from 18 to 60. I think the median age was close to 30. There were about 100 African Americans, and the first African American officers to ever serve in United States forces, although these weren't official forces, was in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, but they had the first African American officers. So they really tried to put into practice their beliefs. Most of them were not real ideological. There were some who identified as communists, but most of them, they were avid anti-fascists.
Right, right. Yeah, if I recall, I think that Arthur Miller, in his account of driving Ralph Neafus to New York, which again I would join you in recommending it highly to everybody. It's really just kind of vintage Miller, but with this sort of almost Keystone Cop aspect, where they're driving this Model T Ford that could break down at any minute and loses its brakes. But then with this very touching and clear account of his own wrestling with and feeling like perhaps he's failed a friend.
Right, and they end up in Brooklyn, and Nephas stays for a few days with the family, and his mother is giving Nephas dirty looks because she knows what he's about to do, and she's afraid he'll draw her son to Spain.
But I think if I might be remembering wrong, but I think that Miller says that he it was not clear to him, you know, if Neafus was a socialist or a communist or a liberal or what. He just knew that he was an anti-fascist. I mean, that he was compelled to do this.
Right. They had washed dishes together in the co-op, which is now the Thayer building, I believe. Or no, not the Thayer building. It's the Women's Studies building.
Oh, Lane Hall?
Lane Hall, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a student co-op, evidently, and in the basement, a big kitchen, and they were dishwashers side by side. And that's how they'd gotten to know each other. And of course, they were both very concerned about fascism and the Spanish Civil War. And so they'd been friends for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when Neafus was captured, there was as you were saying, this fairly substantial push by students and student organizations to get the State Department to take some action, and you know, but again, in this environment of strict neutrality on the part of the U.S. government, which many students and others would argue was actually a non-neutrality, because Germany and Italy were heavily supporting the nationalist forces in Spain. But it comes to the student senate takes this up, and there's this 14-13 vote against a resolution to appeal to the department. Do we have more on that? Do we know what the arguments were like, or what happened in that particular debate?
You mean around non-intervention?
I mean specifically about. I was asking specifically about the Michigan Student Senate rejection of the resolution to ask for help for Neafus.
Well, going by what appears on the op-ed pages, I think there was a substantial number of students who thought, as I mentioned before, he knew what he signed up for. And all of these student volunteers, they took a big risk, and they knew there could be consequences, and there was still so much nationwide support for isolationism, as you mentioned. And a lot of students probably supported non-intervention, and certainly that is reflected in on the op-ed pages, that there are arguments supporting.
Yeah. So I want to get to audience questions, but there is one other thing I wanted to raise. And you know, I had mentioned at the beginning that there are some ways in which this all feels too timely. Before our session tonight, I just did some quick checking of metrics. You know, if you look at fascist or fascism on Google's Ngram, which, you know, looks for, I mean, scans all of these books that Google has digitized, you find that the use of fascist or related terms is at its highest point now since 1949. The last time it was this high was 1949. It took a big dip, and now it's on the rise. And similarly, Google searches for the term fascist in September reached a remarkable peak, tailed off, but now in the last little bit, they've been rising again. When we were talking before, you said that you had mentioned that, you know, your students sort of, we saw some resonances with our situations today. And I wonder if you could just say something about that. I mean, what did they, how do they reflect on this episode in American and U of M history with respect to current events? If that's a fair question.
Well, I've taught the course on the Spanish Civil War several times, and I would say only last year did more students start making some connections, but still classic fascism, Nazism and Mussolini, there are enough differences between Trumpism, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest is Trumpism's lack of discipline, right? Because discipline was fundamental to fascism.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly the kind of fascist effervescence that occurred in the rallies, that's a point of connection I think students make. But where I really saw a connection made explicitly was this past summer when I taught a course that kind of covered youth in the 20s and 30s and the political turn and the polarization. And then after Franco's forces win the war, the brutal repressions, and the young socialist students who were rounded up and executed, masses. Mm-hmm. And students started making connections on their own between Black Lives Matter and police coming in and taking these young people, killing these young people, and so I think we have to be cautious about connections,
right,
between classic fascism and what's happening now and what we call it right-wing authoritarianism, but I think students are picking up on parallels, the racism, which is always a key ingredient in all fascisms. And so I never like to push connections, I just
I understand.
leave it with them to see them where they are.
Right.
Merit.
No, I understand. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have a few questions that have come in from the audience, and please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to enter them into the Q&A. And we'll start with this. Do you know if any of the students who organized these events studied abroad in Spain or planned to study abroad at some point in Spain? I'm wondering about their connection to Spain at the time in general. Was there a general sort of connection for any of them, other than what they were seeing in the papers, I guess, that you know of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never seen any references to studying abroad. I think that was pretty rare at the time. And the first references to studying abroad I ever heard of were Ivy League universities. And often it was Paris, right? Not so much Spain. So I don't think there were. There were some professors in the department from Spain, though. And I mentioned Professor Albaladejo. But I did find an article that enrollment in Spanish and Italian had suddenly surged. The headline was "Students flock to Spanish and Italian classes, and the department can't provide enough instructors, and instead of having 20 to 25 students, they're having 35."
Right. What about the women students? Their involvement with these activities and the activism.
That's something a lot of my students always look for. They want to know, okay, what was the involvement of women, And one thing that I have to explain to them is, at the time, within the broad leftist social movements, feminism wasn't really much on the radar, right? The big concern was fascism. The big concern was racism, was lynching, and women were more subjected to traditional roles, but there were activist women like David Warren's mother, Mary Cummins, but I don't see the names of women coming up too much in terms of leaders, any student leaders who are listed. But I'm sure they were in all of these activities that students were holding. I'm sure women were very much involved. Not credit.
Yeah. Here's somebody who's maybe we can say more about this. I don't know. Here's somebody who's asking for clarification on why the government, why did the government refuse to get involved with recovering Neafus and the three others who were captured with him?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why the non-intervention policy? The atrocities of the war became more and more known, and the civilian bombings, even though there were atrocities on both sides, they were massively more common on the part of the military rebels. So the way it's usually explained is that even though Roosevelt sympathized with Spain, he would have liked to have aided Spain. There was the isolationist sentiment that was so strong in the country. Second, a large portion of Roosevelt's coalition were Catholics, and the Catholic Church was officially in support of military rebels, even though many Catholics were sympathetic to the Republic. And either fear of war or just trying to postpone it. I think there was a general acceptance that another world war seemed inevitable because of German and Italian expansion. You know, of course, Britain had adopted an appeasement policy, but you know, Hitler was taking Sudetenland and then Czechoslovakia and Austria and Italy and Abyssinia. And so everyone in the world was watching the fascists build a huge military complex, if you will, and expand. And I think they knew it was inevitable, but hold it off, hold it off.
Right, right. You know, one question I actually had, so of course, you know, we know that in the end, Nazism and Italian fascism were defeated, and in fact, some people were brought to account for their war crimes. But given that Franco was in power undisturbed I mean, there was there ever any sort of accountability for the war crimes or atrocities that the nationalists perpetrated?
Yeah, that's been a huge controversy in Spain, especially over the past 20 years, when Spain underwent a transition to democracy after Franco died in 1975. They implemented what's called the Pact of Forgetting, or the Pact of Silence. And not everyone in the country, but people in positions of power didn't want to break it open again. People were so afraid of reinciting that violence. So many people still living who'd been through the war, who'd had family members killed and executed on either side. And so they suppressed any memory, if they could, of that conflict. Then around the year 2000, what's called the memory boom starts up, and it's a movement for the recovery of historical memory. And a nationwide organization started to try to exhume the hundreds of mass graves all over Spain. And that is still ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
And as governments change from under the Socialist Party or the Popular Conservative Party, there's more funding, there's more exhumations, or less, according to the government in power. But there's never been a real accounting. There's never been a truth commission, although there are so many people and organizations who have pressed for that and continue to press for that.
Thank you. This question, to what extent did the Soviet Union provide aid to the Republicans?
Oh yeah, that's one of the complexities I didn't bring up, because the geopolitics are just so complicated. So the Soviet Union stood back during the first 3 months of the war. They, along with Germany and Italy, signed the non-intervention pact, but Germany and Italy immediately broke it. And the Communist Party in Spain, when the Civil War broke out, was very small. It was between 30 and 40,000 adherents. It grew a lot over the next few years. The Falange, the fascist party, was also very small, about 30 to 40,000, and it grew tremendously during the Civil War and after. But Stalin held back until it became clear that Germany and Italy were going all out, that Madrid was about to fall in November of 36, and Stalin started sending then planes and advisors, ammunition, arms. And there was really no comparison between the amount of aid that the Soviet Union sent. Italy sent 80,000 soldiers who fought in Spain, and Hitler sent the Condor Legion, pilots, planes, massive amounts of arms, tanks, advisors, but not large numbers of troops. And then the other source of troops for the nationalists or the military rebels was from Morocco. They recruited about 60 to 70,000 Moroccans. And if it hadn't been for the Moroccans and the Italians, they would never have had enough.
Wow. Can you talk about what happens to students, particularly American Student Union students, post-39, and in reference to anti-communist repression that follows, and ways in which that might have played out on campus? Of course, we know lots of ways in which anti-communism played out on campus later. But what about generally the progressive ASU type students at U of M, or even the particular individuals that you brought up?
Well, one thing I haven't yet had the time to research extensively is what happened to the students who identified as communists and led the very small ASU in the 2 years after the end of the Spanish Civil War, before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and then suddenly the communist position flipped again. But there was a group that was expelled, I think it's either fall of 40 or 41. And I mean, I've just here and there looked up pages of the Daily over the subsequent years. there were attempts after World War II to form a Marxist club, but then a bunch of business students invaded the meeting on the day they were going to elect officers and took over. There's efforts, small groups of left-leaning students continue to make efforts after World War II. Then the late 40s, early 50s, McCarthyism sets in, and then it becomes risky to
right.
and any leftist activities that could be deemed communist.
Right. So you mentioned, you said a little bit about, I mean, the increasing student interest in Spanish and so forth, and a couple of the faculty, but did the faculty, was there any sort of public stance taken either by the Department of Romance Languages or whatever it was at the time, or private actions that stand out?
I haven't seen that. I think they were very cautious, as academics, and saw the ideological complexity that was happening. There was tremendous support for the Spanish Republic, but I think a lot of academics understood that those on the Republican side were very factionalized. There was a very large anarchist movement, larger than either the socialists or the communists, by far centered more in Catalonia, Barcelona. Some sectors of the Republican government became more Sovietized over time, although as a whole, the Republican government always maintained centrism. But I think there was that caution just because of the complexity of it. But at the same time, I think individually, a lot of professors supported the Republic. I mentioned Professor Slauson, who lectures on ideology, and Professor Albaladejo, who took part in the medical aid committee.
Thank you. Yeah. This person's asking for some clarification and notes that the pro-Nazi German-American Bund was active in Ann Arbor during the pre-World War II period. You said you weren't aware of any open sympathy for this group on the U of M campus. Is that right? Is that from what you could tell?
Yeah, that I have not seen it, but it may be there. Searching the digital data, maybe articles on the Bund. I just have not happened across them, and I hadn't made those. Right. But no, that's a great question.
Yeah. You mentioned the Harlan Cowell. This person is asking if there's more information on that individual. Are there any archives anywhere that you know of? And any idea what the letter they found on him is or what it says?
It was an unfinished letter in his pocket, Dear Charles. And as far as I know, they never figured out who Charles was, or at least not at that time. Let me see. Yeah, for a long time, I did not even know about Call because all of the material on University of Michigan volunteers didn't include him. They included the other three. And then I came upon his articles about him, and he had only dropped out, I think, a semester before. He was working his way through school as a hospital orderly and really short of money, and his grades suffered. And So his friends described him in articles in the Daily after he was killed, described that he'd had a very troubled last year at the university. But other than that, I have not found more information. The website of the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, you can look up any volunteer and they'll have a which I included in the slideshow. And they have more on other volunteers, but yeah, I have not found more about him. But if you search the Daily, you'll find a few more articles about him.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think this may be our last question from the audience. Do you believe that current conditions centering around the decline of global capitalism will promote student activism to combat the creeping specter of contemporary fascism, and how might that occur? So we may have already touched on that. If you have anything to add.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I sense that students are becoming much more concerned, much more involved. And that book by Robert Cohen, When the Old Left Was Young, the first chapter is really interesting, and it's entertaining, in fact, because it describes all the frivolity on college campuses all through the 20s. And even during the first years of the Great Depression, the effects of the Depression hadn't yet hit the middle class. And of course, students who could afford college in those years tended to be middle class or above. And they were markedly apolitical through the 20s and early 30s. But as world fascism is on the rise, as they see the effects and experience the effects of the Great Depression, there's movements in the country against lynching, the labor movement under the CIO is in full swing. There's the Flint sit-down strike is happening, River Rouge happening, and students, they become much more politicized. And I think that's something that rises and falls. And I think this is a time when students will likely continue to be more involved and become more activist.
Right, right. Good. Well, Julie, this has been really great, really informative, and a real pleasure for me. You know, as you had said, this is really a complicated period. This is a complicated set of issues. We could go on talking for hours, I think, because there is so much here. But this has been a great discussion. Is there any last thing that you would like to leave people with?
Oh.
Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, one thing I've been thinking about a lot, given all that's happened this past year, and when I was teaching this summer course after George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter, I changed the course to veer more into the 1930s, the Republican Civil War. And I took my cues from a Spanish philosopher, Jose Ortega y Gasset, who was not particularly liberal, but he's famous for saying, yo soy yo y mi circunstancia. I am I and my circumstance. And I think he got that idea actually from American pragmatist philosophy. He was a reader of William James. And I think we all have to, in our own historical moment, particularly as we're coming of age, face our circumstance. and seek to understand it and join in dialogue with other people about how do we understand this, our historical moment, and how do we act, what is to be done together. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. Appreciate it. Our next webinar will actually be in February, so you'll see about that. You'll also get a link to the recording of this when it's up on YouTube. So please share it and rewatch if you're so inclined. And in the meantime, I just want to say to everybody, stay safe, wear masks, and stay well through the coming months. Thank you, Julie. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye bye.